Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our seventh town hall, where we will hear from our professional conduct team. Just a reminder that the purpose of the town halls is to provide information to registrants and other system partners on various topics of interest. All of these town halls are recorded and posted on the CRPO's YouTube channel. The slides are also posted on the website under our latest news posts. So if you have missed any or you would like to go back and revisit any of those presentations, they are available on our website. They're also linked on the housekeeping slide here, which, as I noted, we share with folks after the town hall has ended. So this part of the website is where you'll also find links to join the town halls and the links to the surveys where you can ask questions related to the topics. Speaking of questions, if you have any questions during the session today, please make use of the Q&A feature and staff will respond. For the questions that we received in advance, we've incorporated those into the presentation slides. And finally, just a reminder to please keep yourselves muted for the duration of the session. And you can also disable your video feed if you'd like. So with that, I will pass it on to CRPO President Ken Lomp to provide a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Amy. So good afternoon, everyone, and a bit of a belated Happy New Year. As Amy pointed out, I'm Ken Lomp, and I'm the current president of the CRPO. I would like to begin by welcoming you to today's town hall. It's great to have an opportunity to share information with registrants. Please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So just a quick reminder about this town hall series. So far, we have held 5 English and 1 French town hall covering a variety of topics. On that note, we are very pleased by the number of registrants that have attended. Additionally, the recordings of those sessions are available on the college's YouTube channel if you're interested in any of them. You can see we have the February session planned, and we will publish the March date shortly. Please stay tuned for that. You will receive a separate invitation to each of the upcoming sessions. If you have questions about those the topics being presented, please email them to info@crpo.ca. That's info@crpo.ca. Today's session is really framed around questions, excuse me, around questions we received in advance through the survey for this town hall directly. So thank you to all of those who took the time to pose questions for us. Any questions that we don't get to today will be included in a summary in the town. Oops, what did I say there? Okay. Any questions we don't get to will be included in the summary of the town hall today and made available on the college's website. Staff are going to provide you with some background information on how the college's conduct processes work. They will walk you through the summaries of the kinds of complaints and reports we get and how they are resolved. I understand that as professionals, the prospect of a complaint, the time it will take to resolve it, and the impact it could have on our professional lives is something that can be worrying. The goal here is to help shed light on the processes that we know can be daunting for registrants. We want to provide you with the information you need to understand how the complaint and report process is set up to be thorough and fair. CRPO uses a right touch, risk-based approach to regulation. Over the past year, we have been working to ensure that we are also incorporating best practices that are trauma-informed. This combination ensures public protection and fairness for registrants through a model that balances due diligence.
I mute my audio.
Why?
I'm hearing somebody. Can you please make sure you're muted, folks? Thank you. Okay, so let me backtrack a sentence or two. So CRPO uses a right touch, risk-based approach to regulation. Over the past year, we have been working to ensure that we are also incorporating best practices that are trauma-informed. This combination ensures public protection and fairness for registrants through a model that balances due diligence with compassion. You'll see this in the statistics staff will share, which will show that a significant majority of complaints and reports are resolved in supportive remediation. And although this presentation is about complaints, reports, and discipline, we will be including a look at the proactive side of the regulatory toolkit as well. Professional development obligations, the CBA, peer coaching, peer circles, and the practices advisory as mechanisms to mitigate risk of complaint by ensuring registrants are meeting the standards of practice. I'm confident that you will find this presentation informative and I hope reassuring about how the regulatory conduct processes work.
So good afternoon. As you heard and are aware, we will be discussing complaints and reports. And by the way, I'm Mark Pioro, Deputy Registrar and General Counsel at CRPO. So the complaint and report process can be thought of as reactive in nature, meaning something has already happened and CRPO is responding. However, it's important to keep in mind that this is just one part of our work, and a lot of the other kinds of things. The other aspects of the work we do can be thought of as proactive or preventive or transparent. So you can see an example on the next slide. The practice standards, they are an example of transparent regulation. They are publicly available. They set the objective criteria against which issues are measured. Similarly, the registration process can be thought of as preventive regulation because it aims to ensure that only ethical and professional competent practitioners are registered. If we move ahead, it mentions some examples of proactive regulation, which are also ways you can mitigate your own risk of being involved or adversely affected in a complaint or report process. So the examples include professional development, as all registrants are required, that is 40 hours every 2 years, a self-assessment, various kinds of continuing education. So build your PD plan accordingly and benefit
That's
your...
what I'm used to, actually. That's what I'm used to, even when Kevin...
Thanks. Another way to mitigate your risk is through the CBA, or case-based assessment, which is an objective way to identify areas where you might need to review and learn about the standards. And as you know, that is the assessment that registrants are selected to go about once every 5 years. We also offer peer circles working in conjunction with the OAMHP. We hope to deliver this supportive activity, which gives registrants the opportunity to hear from peers, have an in-depth discussion about the standards, and focus on, and keep in mind that these cases, these peer circles focus on the areas where the college sees a lot of concerns. There's the practice advisory service. Anyone is welcome to contact the service and ask which rules or resources apply or are relevant to a situation. And there's clinical supervision, whether required by the college or as a voluntary additional supervision. This, of course, focuses on client well-being and so should assist registrants in meeting standards. We also encourage the use of CRPO's clinical supervision tool. While it was originally intended as part of exam preparation, it can also be used by anyone looking to find a way to solidify their learning and understanding of competencies or standards. So all of these, as mentioned, are examples of proactive regulation, which can reduce the risk of complaints. With that overview of the various work that CRPO does, we can now look at some details of the professional conduct process. We will begin with where we get our legal authority. And by the way, the links on these slides can be clicked after we send them out later on. So first, the Health Professions Procedural Code. This sets out the requirements for every Ontario regulated health profession college's investigation and hearing process. For example, it talks about next steps after receiving a complaint or report, what some of the possible outcomes are, who must sit on a panel, and so forth. The code at section 51, along with CRPO's professional misconduct regulation, precisely define every example of what's considered professional misconduct. As mentioned already, the practice standards document goes into more detail and commentary on those otherwise more minimal legal provisions. One of the most serious forms of misconduct, of course, is sexual abuse of a client. The code also has definitions and penalties around that. We don't have time to discuss all the details, but I'll just briefly mention CRPO currently has a policy that RPs must not have sexual contact with a former client for at least 5 years, possibly longer if there's an ongoing power imbalance. Late last year, the Ontario government publicly consulted on a CRPO proposal to make this into a formal regulation, which would give it more legal force. This is still pending, and we will let the community know if and when the change from a policy to a regulation happens. With all that background, I'll hand things off to Nakai Garnett, the CRPO Director of Regulatory Affairs, to talk about the complaint and report process.
Thank you, Mark. Before discussing the complaints and reports process, it's very helpful, I think, to understand the role of the committee that addresses these concerns. And that committee is called the Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee, or more commonly referred to as the ICRC. The ICRC's role is to make decisions in the interest of the public. They do this through maintaining a fair and unbiased process. And as a whole committee, they establish college policies regarding the screening process to review complaints and reports. And my colleague Jenna will discuss one of these policies a little later on. And in panels, the ICRC screens complaints and other concerns about registrants and decides how to deal with them. The ICRC panel process is paper-based. They consider all their information in paper form, but sometimes they also review audio and video recordings as well as pictures. It's important to note that they do not assess credibility or make findings. So for example, if they receive a complaint or concern and the client and RRP have two very different versions of events, the ICRC cannot determine which version is accurate. The ICRC's fair and unbiased process it takes a lot of work, and a lot of effort is put into ensuring that they're competent and able to address complaints and other concerns in a fair and unbiased process. This is accomplished through extensive training, the development of policies to ensure fairness and consistency, as well as thoughtful deliberations. So now we'll just turn and look at the complaints and reports process, looking at the next slide. So the ICRC actually addresses three different matters, or three different ways that they receive concerns. So they receive formal complaints. They also receive registrar's reports, as well as incapacity inquiries. So formal complaints and registrar's reports both address concerns regarding professional misconduct or incompetence. And you may be wondering, well, what is professional misconduct? Well, that's, for example, breaching an ethical standard, failing to meet or breach the standards of practice, or crossing the boundaries of the therapeutic relationship. And then in terms of incompetence, that's displaying a lack of knowledge, skill, or judgment, or it could be also the disregard for the welfare of a client to the nature or an extent that it demonstrates that the RP is unfit to practice or that their practice should be restricted in some sense. And also, as I mentioned, they address incapacity inquiries. And incapacity is when a registrant is suffering from a physical or mental condition or disorder that makes it desirable in the interest of the public that that registrant no longer be permitted to practice or that their practice be restricted. The two main types of matters, though, that the ICRC does consider are formal complaints and registrar's reports. And the two processes are somewhat similar, but they do have different key differences as well. So one of the many differences is that in a complaint, the person that files the complaint, also known as the complainant, is a party to the process, as opposed to in a report, the person that files the report, or also known as the reporter, is not a party to the process. So that means in a complaint, a complainant will receive a copy of the decision along with the RP, who's the subject of the complaint, but in a report, the reporter will not receive a copy of the decision, only the RP, and they won't receive updates throughout the process as well. In addition, complaints tend to be reported or filed by the client or a family member, whereas reports can be filed by a client or a family member, but are often reported by an RP or another health professional. And also important is that to note is the potential for appeal or request for review process. So for complaints, you can appeal or request a review by an independent body called the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board, or also as an acronym HPARB. However, for a report, that is not the case. You cannot make an appeal to HPARB. Although there are these marked differences, the two processes are similar in that the available outcomes that the ICRC can order when making a decision are the same for both complaints and reports. Now moving on to the next slide. I'd like to discuss mandatory reports. So mandatory reports are one way in which the college receives reports. And this information comes to the attention of the registrar through a mandatory report. And the CRPO covers the requirements for mandatory reporting in Standard 1.3. And this standard aligns with sections 85 of the Health Professions Procedural Code. And as you can see from the slide, there are three main ways in which we receive mandatory reports through the requirement for registrants to file a mandatory report when they have reasonable grounds to believe that another RP has practiced unsafely, or if a regulated health professional has reasonable grounds that a client was sexually abused by an RP. It's important to note that if it relates to sexual abuse, in any instance in terms of how you file a mandatory report, you need the consent of the client, in written consent rather, before being able to disclose their identity. There are also mandatory reporting requirements for facilities if they believe that they have reasonable grounds to believe that a registrant is incompetent, incapacitated, or has sexually abused a client, as well as an employer. They have a mandatory reporting requirement to file a report within 30 days if they terminate, revoke, or suspend or impose restrictions on a registrant, or they dissolve their partnership, health professional, corporation, or association with that registrant for reasons or belief that there's professional misconduct, incompetence, or incapacity. For more information regarding the mandatory reporting obligations, you can look at the CRPO's website, where there's a wealth of information regarding the mandatory reporting process, as well as the reporting forms. It's also important to note that there are also mandatory self-reporting requirements for RPs, and further information regarding that is on the website. Now, moving along to assessing risk. As you would be aware, or probably are aware, the potential risk to the public is something that's key in mind when staff and the ICRC are engaging and triaging the complaints and reports process. And the potential risk to the public is assessed throughout the process, starting from the receipt of a complaint or report at intake, up to and including when the ICRC makes their decisions. And throughout the process, the impact of trauma is considered, as well as not only, to the complainant or reporter, but also to the registered psychotherapist as well, who is the subject of the complaint or report. And thus, how an investigation is managed also takes into consideration potential risks to the public, and also feeds into how we prioritize cases and allocate resources when investigating a complaint or a report. This is an example of the complaint risk assessment tool. And the complaint risk assessment tool is our current tool, is an example of a current tool that is used at intake to assess the risk of a complaint when it's received. This tool is used by staff and allows staff to flag higher risk concerns so that those cases those complaints rather can be prioritized. Moving to the next slide. We'll look at an example of how risk is assessed, risk to the public is assessed at the ICRC stage. And this is an example of a tool currently used by the ICRC. It's their worksheet that they work through when deliberating a complaint or report as a panel. As you can see, there are various considerations that the panel makes. Their first step is to consider whether or not to refer the matter to the discipline committee, and my colleague Mark will discuss the discipline committee a bit further. And then the next step is to analyze the issues and looking at risk when looking at each of the issues that have been brought forward by the complainant or the reporter as part of the process. The panel also considers factors such as client harm, intent, competence, communication, public trust, the governability of the RP, as well as remorse, insight, and whether or not it's an isolated event or pattern of conduct when making decisions with respect to a complaint or report using this risk assessment framework. And then moving now to the next slide. So after the panel makes a decision, there needs to be an outcome, obviously. How will the panel, or what will the panel decide in terms of what, if any, required action is required on the part of the registrant based on the assessed risk? And this image walks through from the top to the bottom the outcomes that are available to the ICRC based on the assessed level of risk. Starting from the top, there in green are the outcomes that are low or no risk. So based on that assessed risk, because it's low, it then results in information not being posted on the public register. Because it's determined that the outcome is low risk and there is a low risk to the public, the information with respect to if there is an outcome that requires follow-up on the registrant's part, is not posted on the public register as a result. So for take no action, obviously there's no assessed risk, and then issuing a written advice is low risk, and that entails a letter of advice being sent or provided to the registrant. A remedial agreement is a negotiated agreement with the registrant. The registrant has to agree, and that entails often requiring a reflection paper to be prepared by the registrant. And then we move to the low medium risk outcome. So we see there's one, the remedial undertaking. So similar to a remedial agreement, it is negotiated with the registrant, but because the risk that's assessed is low to medium, it results in information being posted on the public register. And it remains on the public register until the requirements outlined in the undertaking are completed. And the undertaking usually encompasses or requires a clinical supervision and or the completion of education or training in order to address the ICRC's concerns. Then moving along to medium risk outcomes, we have SCRPS, which stands for Specified Continuing Education or Remediation Program. And these are education or training requirements that might be required of a registrant based on the assessed level of risk. Because it's determined to be medium risk, as you can see, it is the outcome is posted on the public register. And similarly, cautions, oral cautions are moderate risk or medium risk, and they're also posted on the public register. And an oral caution is essentially the registrant appears virtually before a member of the committee of the ICRC to receive a warning, if you will, in terms of their conduct or behavior to potentially or hopefully prevent a reoccurrence from happening and the RP in future appearing before a future panel of the ICRC. Then moving on to the darker orange, we have the immediate to high outcome, so restrictive undertakings. And so restrictive undertakings can include situations involving a medium to high risk to the public. And the registrant, in consultation with the college, will voluntarily agree to restrict their practice or resign from the college and agree to never reapply. Similar to undertakings that are remedial in nature, as well as the agreements, the RP would have to agree to the undertaking. And when a registrant resigns in such circumstances, a note to that effect will be posted on the public register and it will remain on the public register. If it's a restriction to the registrant's or the RP's practice, that usually denotes that the ICRC believes that the restriction is the best way to protect the public while allowing the RP to gain competence in the area that has been identified as a potential deficiency. And then moving down to the bottom of the image, you'll see that there are referrals to the discipline committee. This is where an investigation reveals a serious concern posing a high risk to the public, and so it's posted on the public register. And there's information to suggest that there's sufficient evidence to support what's would be a legal hearing. And in turn, the ICRC will refer specified allegations of professional misconduct or incompetence to the discipline committee. And that discipline committee holds a formal hearing. And my colleague Mark, as I mentioned, will discuss further the discipline process a little later on. So these are the outcomes available to the ICRC when issuing a decision. I will now hand it over to my colleague Jenna Smith, who's CRPO's Professional Conduct Manager, to discuss the frivolous and vexatious complaints process.
Thanks, Nakai. Okay, so what is a frivolous and vexatious complaint? The word frivolous means that there is no serious purpose or value, that the matter is trivial or meritless. Vexatious is defined as having no reasonable or probable cause, or that the issue is groundless. For example, it could be something like harassment or annoyance instituted maliciously or from improper motives. every formal complaint must be adequately investigated by the college. However, frivolous and vexatious complaints are the very rare exception. A small subset of complaints may clearly have no merit, seek to relitigate a claim already decided, or are brought for an improper purpose or abusive process. For example, to be used as evidence in another proceeding. If a panel considers the complaint to be frivolous, vexatious, made in bad faith, moot, or otherwise an abusive process, it must notify the complainant and the registrant of its intent to take no action and give both parties 30 days to respond. ICRC would then meet again to consider everyone's submissions and make a final decision. These F&V outcomes can be appealed and overturned at the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board, or HPARB, as Nakai mentioned earlier, if appropriate requirements are not met. And F&V decisions aren't required to be considered when looking at prior history. So on the next slide, I will discuss a little bit about the criteria for refusal. There are specific criteria and some examples are provided here. So things like personal disputes that do not call into question the professionalism of the registrant. Could be repetitious complaints, so after the first complaint, regarding the same issues filed by the same complainant, which do not provide substantial new information. Complaints made for ulterior or improper reasons could also be frivolous and vexatious. That might be something like harassment, legal bullying, attempts at influencing the outcome of a separate dispute. And then finally, matters that would be better addressed in another forum, for example, something that should be actually taken to court. On the next slide, I will tell you a little bit about our policy on declining to investigate a complaint. This policy was created to provide transparent criteria for consistent decisions as to when the ICRC may decline to investigate a complaint. The policy is there to also ensure public protection by allocating resources to complaints involving an apparent risk of harm. Also to prevent and mitigate trauma caused by investigations that are not in the public interest to carry out. So for example, if the college is choosing to investigate a complaint from someone who is abusing the registrant, the college is contributing to that trauma by participating in the investigation process. ICRC issued a total of 8 frivolous and vexatious outcomes in 2024. And so that's approximately 6.5% of complaints decided. So as I said, it's quite rare. However, I do want to make really clear that approximately 53% of complaint allegations end in a take no action outcome. So again, of the ones investigated, 53% of complaint allegations often end in a take no action outcome. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but just to show that while many complaints might not meet the criteria for a frivolous and vexatious outcome, ICRC observes no concerns in the majority of allegations it receives. On the next slide, I will discuss a little bit about the conduct statistics. Before beginning this portion of my presentation, I just want to thank our data analyst, Morgan Porteous, for pulling most of the data that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Over the last 2 years, she has spent a considerable amount of time coding professional conduct data to ensure the college as a whole is set up to observe patterns, assess risk, and engage in data-informed decision-making. So I'm going to start here with formal complaints. We received 156 complaints in 2024. That is actually an increase of 50 complaints or 47% when compared to the previous calendar year. This increase is likely attributed to the steady increase in psychotherapists who are being registered with the college, improved accessibility to psychotherapy services through insurance providers, and also general knowledge of the college's existence and of our complaints process across Ontario. So I think the public is aware we're here. In the same time frame, ICRC issued 123 complaint decisions. And I just want to pause here to make a note that not all files are opened and closed in the same calendar year. So many of the decisions issued by ICRC in 2024 correspond to files that were opened in 2023. In terms of reports, 103 reports were opened in 2024. This is an increase of 9 reports or 9.5% compared to the previous year. And 96 reports were also closed in that same calendar year. Next is registrar's reports. So in situations where there are reasonable and probable grounds of misconduct that cannot be remediated informally, a report will transition into what's called a registrar's report. This is generally reserved for medium to high risk issues. In 2024, only 15 reports turned into registrar's reports. This is similar to 2023. And so we've kind of seen a bit of a steady decrease in registrar's reports over recent years as a result of informal action that the college is taking on low risk matters. And I'm going to provide some more information to you about those informal outcomes on a different slide. So we'll get there in a minute. And then finally, discipline. So in 2024, ICRC referred a total of 6 matters to the discipline committee. Okay, so on the next slide, I will discuss reports received in 2024. So the college takes a right touch approach to regulation, meaning it uses only as much regulation as is necessary to protect the public. The investigation and outcome should be proportionate, targeted, and consistent to the risk of harm to the public. Of the 103 reports opened last year, 59 were closed in that same calendar year. Most of those 59 reports that were opened and closed, there was no formal investigation necessary, meaning most of them did not require formal registrar's report. You'll see here that 34 files were closed with formal notice, meaning staff reviewed the report and promptly notified the registrant through secure letter that there were no concerns, and as such, the file would be closed. And that outcome can be combined with the 4 other files you can see in this graph labeled as closed with informal notice. In other words, we emailed the registrant to let them know that we were closing the file. 10 files were closed with advice from the registrar. That means the concerns are minor and that informal advice from the registrar would be sufficient to satisfy any concerns about risk of harm to the public. The registrar would share her concerns about what occurred in writing, make recommendations aimed at improvement, and direct the RP to any relevant resources that could be helpful for the person. Once that advice was sent to the registrant, the file was closed. 5 files were processed as a complaint, meaning the reporter changed their mind and wished to submit their concerns through the complaint process instead. So this does happen sometimes. Some people choose to do this just because they want to see a copy of the decision. And as a reporter, you don't get a copy of the decision. In a complaint process, the complainant does receive a copy of the decision. 2 files were closed with embedded advice, meaning the file was opened and staff provided a sentence or 2 of very minor advice. 3 files were closed with informal compliance requirements, meaning, I'll give you an example. It could be an RP's advertising required some minor amendments. And so staff would provide the registrant with 30 days to make the requested changes. So long as those changes were made, the file would be closed. These informal outcomes are not public and don't require the involvement of the ICRC. And you'll see here the last sort of bucket there labeled TNA, that means take no action. This report did transition to a registrar's report, but ended in a take no action outcome. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to talk about we'll move on to the next one. Perfect. Okay, thank you. So there were 265 individual issues that were coded in report files opened in 2024. Many of these files are still pending decision. We code each individual issue for each individual report. And so most files have more than one issue that we are coding. Of these files, the most common allegations are related to the 6 practice standards that you see here. So standard 6.2, advertising. This includes registrants providing misleading information to the public around their qualifications, use of title, or scope of practice. This also included things like making promises about the guaranteeing success of services, for example. Standard 1.5a, disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional conduct. For example, unprofessional communication or being unprepared for client sessions. Standard 1.5b, conduct unbecoming. For example, inappropriate social media posts. Standard 2.1, consultation, clinical supervision, and referral. So that would be like treating a client that the registrant ought to have referred elsewhere or failing to seek supervision when necessary. Dual or multiple relationships was another common theme, and that includes things like breaching boundaries, inappropriate self-disclosure as well. And then finally, confidentiality. So leaving client files unattended, for example, in public spaces, or sending emails to the wrong client. So the next slide, we will look at outcomes. So in 2024, ICRC issued formal decisions in 23 registrars' investigations. This graph shows the outcomes for all of those 23 files. And those 23 files contain 45 allegations. You'll note the most common issue we see is categorized as professional conduct and behavior. This bucket includes issues like conflict of interest, conduct unbecoming, confidentiality, objectivity or bias, accepting the regulatory responsibility of the college, and disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional conduct. The bucket you see here titled competence and patient care is the next most common issue. And this included things like reporting unsafe practices, consultation, clinical supervision and referral, consent, electronic practice, unnecessary treatment, and discontinuing services. 38% of allegations ended in a take no action outcome for registrar's reports. 33% of allegations ended in a medium risk outcome, meaning the outcome was a caution, a SCRP, or an undertaking. And 11% of registrar's reports ended in discipline. It's 11% of allegations. These issues included things like sexual abuse, professional conduct and behavior, and competence and patient care. The remaining 18% of issues were comprised of low-risk outcomes like written advice or remedial agreements. You'll note here that there are no allegations coded under communication and advertising. This is because those types of issues are generally low risk and resolved informally, as what I discussed previously. So there's often no need to move those types of issues into a formal registrar's report investigation. Okay, so the next slide we'll talk about complaints received in 2024. There are approximately 195 individual issues that we've coded so far in the complaints received in 2024. The top 4 professional practice standards related are all listed here. So disgraceful, dishonorable, and unprofessional conduct. That includes things like inappropriate language and communication with clients, in addition to discussing personal opinions and ideologies with clients. The next is standard 2.1, consultation, clinical supervision, and referral. So for example, failing to seek supervision or make referrals when clients presenting issues were outside the RP's scope of practice. Standard 1.8, undue influence and abuse, excluding sexual abuse. So this is something like intimidating a client or pressuring or influencing a client to make a decision that caused them harm, such as influencing them to separate from their partner or to sign some sort of agreement. And then standard 3.2, consent. We receive a very large number of complaints from parents, typically in the midst of a custody dispute, alleging the RP treated their child without appropriate consent from one or more parents. And then on the next slide is complaint outcomes for 2024. So you can see these mostly categorized as professional conduct and behavior. That's the biggest bucket there. So as a reminder, this is things like conflict of interest, conduct unbecoming, confidentiality, objectivity and bias, accepting the regulatory responsibility of the college, and disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional conduct. And then competence and patient care is the next most common bucket. Again, things like reporting unsafe practices, referral, consultation, clinical supervision and referral, consent, electronic practice, unnecessary treatment, and discontinuing services. Interestingly, the third most common issue complained about relates to fraud. And a large proportion of these allegations are actually linked to complaints received from insurance companies, alleging an RP provided services like an assessment without appropriate clinical supervision or while suspended. Complaints about fraud also relate to RPs submitting receipts to insurance providers for services not actually provided. It's important to note that 57% of the allegations we receive regarding fraud actually end in a take no action outcome after the investigation concludes. So in total for complaints, 53% of allegations end in a take no action outcome. 27% of allegations end in some sort of medium risk outcome. So a remedial outcome like a caution, a skirt, or an undertaking. And 1% of allegations in complaints end in a referral to discipline. The remaining 19% of issues were comprised of low risk outcomes like written advice or remedial agreements. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark now to discuss the discipline process.
Thank you, Jenna. So you've heard a lot about the different complaint outcomes, and you can see from the statistics that relatively few go to the discipline process. So that is helpful context to keep in mind. These are reserved for the most significant matters where there's sufficient evidence for a full hearing. As you can imagine, a hearing is legalistic in nature. Lawyers are involved, evidence is tendered, arguments are made, formal findings are made. If misconduct is found to have occurred, a penalty is imposed. They're largely public. Anyone can observe. You can observe the hearings of this or a different college by visiting their websites. There are detailed decisions published online. The name of CRPO's discipline committee is the Ontario Registered Psychotherapists Discipline Tribunal, or ORPDT. The tribunal name reflects a modern best practice approach to adjudicating discipline hearings. We began this model in 2023. Without getting into too much technical detail, the older model had a panel receive legal advice from an independent lawyer in the room, in the hearing. In the new tribunal approach, there is an experienced adjudicator chairing the panel and administering the tribunal as an independent body. The bottom line is fairness, not to say it was unfair before, but it reinforces the perception of a neutral, independent decision maker, and also efficiency. Various process improvements have led to quicker timelines. What this is not is any kind of outside influence. There are 2 RPs on the panel, 2 members to represent the public, which is part of public protection, and 1 experienced adjudicator, all making the decision together. There's no one from another health profession influencing the RP profession. On the next slide, you can see the list of discipline outcomes. I'll go over them quickly. Revocation, suspension, terms, conditions, limitations, a reprimand, a fine, reimbursing the therapy fund, which we administer, that is for victims of clients who have been sexually abused by a registrant to obtain new counseling or therapy to deal with the harm. And there's also costs. This is separate from penalty. It is a legal principle that the person who caused the hearing through the misconduct should be responsible for some of the cost leading up to the hearing, as opposed to the registrants as a whole paying for it through their registration fees. There are a lot of considerations going into costs, and there's basically a tariff as a compromise approach. It's a standardized amount. It's currently around $6,000 for a hearing day. It's under review, and it actually reflects only a small portion of CRPO's actual costs. Now I'll hand it back to Nakai to give some discipline-related statistics.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. So looking at the discipline committee and the files that were referred to the discipline committee, in 2024, there was 1 complaint referred and 5 registrar reports. And the themes for those matters were sexual abuse, conduct unbecoming, or disgraceful, dishonorable, and unprofessional conduct, as well as failure to meet mandatory reporting obligations. And then looking at the next slide, the outcomes for those matters that were disposed of in 2024 included ordered penalties for 7 discipline decisions. 5 of those matters or orders had reprimands. 4 resulted in suspensions. 4 of those penalties included terms, conditions, and limitations, and there were 3 revocations. So the registrant lost their ability to practice. Now moving along quickly to 2 projects that the college has been engaged with to enhance all college processes, including the complaints and reports committee reports processes. The first is the trauma-informed review. So we've discussed this before at other town halls, but the college set out to review its complaints and reports process to ensure its practices are responsive to those who report having experienced trauma, and to ensure practices are trauma-informed and procedurally fair. And we contracted the Barbara Schiffler Commemorative Clinic to undertake a review of the complaints reports process. They looked at problems we'd already identified, and they also determined other areas of work that were not trauma-informed and provided recommendations for improvement. And the Barbara Schiffler Commemorative Clinic provided a report with recommendations, which was accepted by council. And the council then in turn directed the ICRC to work to review, assess, and implement the relevant recommendations. The ICRC is currently implementing these recommendations. And if you want some further information regarding the review and the recommendation, as well as the report, a copy of the report can be found on CRPO's website. And then another project that the college is engaging in is self-ID data collection, which will inform CRPO's processes, including our complaints and reports processes, to ensure a fair and more equitable approach to policies and decision-making. And as you can see here, the purpose of the self-ID data initiative is to identify and address barriers by understanding the diverse backgrounds of its registrants. It will inform policy and practices. So accurate data enables us to develop policies and practices that reflect the diversity of registrants and the communities that we serve, as well as enhance equity impact assessments. So the collective data will support the implementation of what the college is endeavoring to complete an equity impact assessment to ensure that decisions are fair and non-discriminatory. And then in terms of process, it will be voluntary participation. RPs will be encouraged to participate, but they will not be required to. We're hoping to obtain comprehensive demographic information, and we're implementing confidentiality measures. And in turn, we hope that there will be benefits to both registrants as well as the public. So enhanced support, so data-driven insights will allow CRPO to develop resources and support mechanisms tailored to the needs of diverse registrants, as well as improve services and strengthened professional community. So a commitment rather to DEI fosters a more inclusive and supportive professional environment for all registrants. And of course, when dealing with sensitive information, it's important to implement practices to uphold privacy and data security. So there will be data anonymization, as well as ensuring that the data that's collected will be securely stored, as well as ensuring that we comply with regulations, including privacy laws, to ensure ethical handling of the personal information. We will provide further details and guidance as the implementation phase approaches for the self-ID data collection project, and we'll plan information sessions for you to learn more about this project. So next we'll move along to questions that we received in advance of the town hall, and I'll hand it back over to my colleague Mark to address the first question.
Thank you. I'm going to move quickly with our remaining time. The slides will be available later for a full reading. So this first question essentially asks why the ICRC would want a registrant to discharge, discontinue, or refer certain categories of clients with certain conditions. So first, there's no confidential information that I have. I'm only answering in general, not about a specific case. I want to clarify the ICRC can only order education. It can only request restrictions, as Nakai was discussing earlier, those restrictive undertakings. Those can also be done through a full discipline hearing, but that's not what we're talking about. I want to emphasize that this is a rare medium to high risk situation that followed a careful case-by-case assessment, and also assure that CRPO does not take lightly the conclusion that the risk posed in a certain circumstance involving a registrant is greater than that of clients losing access. So in other words, we're very aware that it is important for clients to have access. And so a request for a registrant to not see a particular issue or category of clients would not be made lightly. The next question on the next slide asks how the college would distinguish between remediation aimed at resolving concerns and disciplinary measures intended to address violations. So here's a few quick differences. Procedurally, which committee? ICRC versus ORPDT. The risk level, low or medium versus high. Whether there are concerns expressed or findings made, and the different tools being used. For example, a caution versus a reprimand, there's slightly different wording and tone involved, or education versus suspension. And someone else will answer the next questions.
Thank you. Okay, so this question is unprofessional conduct on social media something the college would see as misconduct? So these types of issues in certain situations may be considered misconduct. The panel carefully considers each file on a case-by-case basis, and they actually have a worksheet or resource to help them assess these mitigating and aggravating factors, but I've provided those factors here on this slide that they consider. So things like ethics and professionalism. Does the registrant's statement or the way it's made reflect poorly on the registrant's honesty, trustworthiness, or competence? Was the registrant acting in a professional or in a personal capacity? Is there evidence of client harm? What was the extent of the publication and the size and the nature of the audience? So did the post reach 3 people, 300 people, or 3 million people? Did clients have access to the content, and was the nature and scope of the damage to, what is the nature and scope of damage to the profession and the public interest? The panel also considers the content of the posting. So was the public expression intended to contribute to social or political discourse about an important issue? If the comment demonstrates hate speech, incites violence, or celebrates human suffering or death, the college may intervene. Regarding exchanges, just a note, exchanges between RPs on social media, that generally it's most helpful for those two disputes to be handled outside of the college's process. And then the next question is, what kind of, sorry, I'm going to talk really quick here. What kind of complaints does the college see where an RP has a dual role? So for example, treating someone from their faith community. It's important to acknowledge that the issue of dual roles is one that the college has considered in the changing context of ways to access care and ensuring we approach practice standards through the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thinking about the shift to promote care since COVID, now that psychotherapy routinely happens virtually, people in smaller and remote communities can access therapists anywhere in Ontario, provided they have reliable internet services. This means that therapists in potentially underserved smaller communities do not necessarily need to take on clients who would be well served through virtual care. And in the context of diversity and equity, communities refer not only to a particular geographic area, but also to racialized, equity deserving, academic, professional, social, spiritual, etc. groups, or to those bound by other unifying experiences or characteristics, such as disability, sexuality, or identity. This means it's possible to live and work within the small community, even when residing in a large population center like Toronto or Ottawa. Living and working within both these kinds of communities means there may be a certain level of overlap between the personal and professional realm. RPs must use their professional and ethical judgment when a conflict of interest or dual relationship arises, reflecting on the safe and effective use of self and the best interests of clients. So in general, it's preferable to avoid conflicts of interest or dual relationships, but when that's not possible, RPs should mitigate potential issues by discussing the risks and benefits of the conflict of interest or the dual relationship as part of the informed consent process. The kinds of complaints we see related to dual relationships typically involve situations where registrants have not done enough upfront to ensure appropriate safeguards are in place to manage those risks. Where clear and explicit conversations have not happened as part of the informed consent discussion, we do see issues like around information sharing, confidentiality, and things like boundaries. Sorry, I talked really fast, and I think that's it. I think if I'm going to turn it over to Amy now. Close this off.
Sure. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned at the start, we will get this recording uploaded onto our YouTube channel, and we'll share that more widely if you know of anyone who was not able to attend today. So thank you again for signing on to the call. And if you have any outstanding questions, you can always email them to info@crpo.ca. And at this point, I will pass it on to Ken Lomp to provide some closing remarks. Thanks, Ken.
I just wanted to echo your thanks, Amy, to everyone. And again, very happy with the numbers of people that attended today. I realized that there was a lot of material and it went through fairly quickly. And again, to underscore what Amy said, if you have any questions remaining, to contact the college at the email address that was shared, and for you to tune into the YouTube channel and the slides of all of the previous this one and all of the previous town halls are there. And again, please continue to engage with the college, whether it's through the practice advisory, by attending peer circles, by including some regulatory focused activities in your professional development to ensure that you have the information you need to practice safely and effectively. We look forward to seeing you at the final 2 town halls later on this year. Thank you again.